Hello, everyone, and welcome to Your Daily Detroit. It is Monday, September 30th, 2024. I am Jer Stays and Steve Freese. We're almost out of September. We've almost run completely out of it. Sold out. None on the shelves.
We're out of Mondays in September. That's true.
Well, we have quite a few things that I think we want to get into because things are still kind of hot. We've got a couple of topics we want to talk about, and then we're going to get into one of your listener questions. I think the first thing I want to mention, Tim Walz was at the Big House, very much in his campaign role, but also made sense because, you know, Michigan, Minnesota, the whole 9 yards. He did a whole promo video where he said he always wanted to go to the Big House his whole life, which, you know, even as a Minnesota fan, like that stadium in Ann Arbor is a special place. And if you're actually into football, and it very much seems so that Tim is, I mean, unless the whole Coach Walz thing is something that's not true, which I fully believe that it is true, but who knows with the conspiracy theories of the internet. It's interesting to see him make appearances here in Michigan and seems to be, I think, in some ways, maybe even more present than Vice President Harris.
Well, for sure. Vice President Harris showed up at the Detroit airport, and that was about it, I think, when she was here for that appearance right when the switch happened.
There was the Oprah deal.
Then she came in like a week and a half ago to sit down in a small studio in Farmington Hills with Oprah, and that's it. They have been sending people in. We talked about this last week. A lot of celebrities, a lot of people like Jane Fonda and Adam Scott, and the cast of I forget now, was it The Sopranos or Parks and Rec? I remember you and I had this whole thing last week where we couldn't remember which one it was.
Scandal,
right. And then, you know, Gwen Walz was in Ann Arbor to do something, and then both of them came. Both Walzes, I don't know. Anyway, came in for this game this weekend, but the principles of the Harris-Walz campaign are not nearly as persistently in the state and in our view, other than on paid media by advertising, as compared to the Trump campaign. Say whatever else you want about them. And I'm not saying that the appearances they're making are great for their campaign, because there's always something crazy and offensive that comes up whenever Donald Trump speaks. But he was here again this past weekend, right? And J.D. Vance has been here. I mean, it's like they've just decided that he's going to camp out here. I guess they think that a Ohio person is going to be very appealing to Michigan people. I don't get that, but it is interesting that they're definitely working for Michigan. They're not taking it for granted, whereas I have a sense that the Harris campaign must have internal polling that's telling them that they don't need to be here as much as they need to be in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. And I mean, every other day I'm getting something Doug Emhoff hanging out in Texas. If it was a one-off, it'd be one thing, but he's been there over and over and over again. I don't know, he just likes it there. And it'll be interesting later, because one of the things that came up after the Hillary Clinton loss in 2016 was that she didn't campaign in Wisconsin. And if she had just campaigned in Wisconsin, she would have won the election, I think. Is that right? Yeah, I think if Wisconsin had gone her way, she would have won. I want to think that they know what they're doing. I'm a little confused by it.
Why don't we talk about that to this piece of news? And I do want to get into the concept of the vice presidential debate that is happening this week. But Axios reported that Alyssa Slotkin, who is obviously, we've mentioned, running for U.S. Senate as a Democrat here, that the polling for her Senate campaign shows that Vice President Harris is underwater in Michigan, and was saying that as part of like a virtual call or whatever. And this is what she's saying, according to Axios, and I quote, "I'm not feeling my best right now about where we are on Kamala Harris in a place like Michigan," Slotkin said during a virtual fundraiser on Wednesday with Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, according to a recording. And then that's where she said that we have her underwater in our polling. So that feels like two different stories to me. It's interesting to see her say that she's underwater, whereas many of the polling averages put Harris on top.
I don't know what she means, because usually when they use the term underwater, they're talking about favorability rating, which is not the same thing as a poll in a competitive election. So I don't know what she means. If she means that the numbers are coming back and showing that Kamala Harris is not personally particularly popular in the state, or if she's losing to Donald Trump in the state. I'm also not sure why she would say that. I'm not sure I understand the point. Because if it was a thing where she was trying to raise money for her campaign by talking about the fact that the presidential candidate is behind or underwater, how would that information encourage people to donate to her Senate campaign? It might encourage people to donate to the presidential campaign, but I don't really get the purpose of her comment. And I don't know if it was very well thought out. At first, I thought it was a bit of a leak on purpose to kind of get them to the state and to the Slotkin race. But she's not saying in that call, so far as we know, that she's losing. She's saying something about Harris's campaign. And maybe what she's saying is what I'm saying, which is these people should be in the state more. And I agree with that. Both of them should be in the state and they should be doing public events and rallies and things like that, but they don't. They haven't done it yet. I mean, one rally at the airport and then left.
At least from my perspective, there needs to be a lot more, and people are going to start casting their votes now. This is the hot season.
Yep.
Get out there. You got to fight for every single vote that you can get. And the state, it is not a lockup. And when it comes to the Slotkin campaign, although the polling averages have her up, and Axios, of course, will gladly share anything anybody gives them. They say that Republican internal polling shows the candidates are statistically tied.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much I buy that for $1 or not, but there is a greater point here that I think was maybe poorly said, because I feel like, sure, she needs to be in the city, but also like she needs to be out in Royal Oak and Troy and those areas of Oakland County where you can pick up tons of votes.
You and I had this conversation about why the campaign's not landing on college campuses, and you properly talked me down about it because you said that it may very well be that they're risk averse to having the whole Gaza issue in their face. Okay. I thought they were going to be coming to Michigan over and over again. Okay. I didn't think they were going to come every so often the way they've been doing. So then you do wonder, great, Tim Walz wanted to go to a football game. Okay. But was that really the best use of his time that day? I don't know. I mean, I guess he got on the TV and there were 100,000 people in that stadium. It was Parents' Weekend, so an awful lot of them were parents and voters and probably suburban Detroit parents to boot and from all over the state. But if you're going to come in here, that's the only thing you do?
I think that's a fine enough appearance for Tim Walz, but people want to see the top of the ticket, right? It's fine that he did that game. That makes perfect sense to me, but he's also running for vice president. And I think Harris needs to show up here more. Well, we were talking about the vice president, so let's talk about these vice president debates. Is there anything that we're looking for to get out of these? I don't know how much these really change the game, although there was that line of I knew John Kennedy and you're no John Kennedy or whatever. There's been some good zingers out of vice presidential debates in the past. But do we have any expectations on anything that could actually change anything?
Probably not. The J.D. Vance of it all is relevant because Trump is so old. And because if Trump loses, then J.D. Vance is going to want to be the avenger or whatever it might be. But he's prevaricated so much that it's just going to be obnoxious to listen to him rail against the media because the media wants to insist that Haitian immigrants are not eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio. And he's going to say, well, my constituents said this, and they really didn't. That's been reported out. The people that brought this claim up in the first place have completely recanted it. Her cat was in the basement, never missing in the first place. we have to go through that stuff. We got to go through JD Vance talking about his family planning ideas and stuff like that. If he goes up there and he, gets stuck talking about childless cat ladies, it's probably good for the Harris ticket. We've had two very consequential debates this year. This is probably going to be the one that we forget pretty quickly.
I hear you, but then I'm like, when we say that, do we jinx it? Then all of a sudden it becomes something interesting?
Yeah, I mean, if it does, it does. I mean, you can't predict what they're going to say and whatever. They are not the top of the ticket. And the two people at the top of the ticket are both forces in their own right. So they can't really be overshadowed. Although I'll give you a prediction. The prediction is that after the debate, Axios or Politico or CNN, New York Times or somebody like that is going to have a story that says that there's a group of Democrats out there who wish Tim Walz had been the top of the ticket. It happens every time, every single time. Why isn't he the running for president instead of her? Whatever. It's a stupid thing that comes up every time. And he'll probably do pretty well. People will probably like him. He certainly has charisma that JD Vance simply does not have. It will be kind of interesting to see if JD Vance tries to simulate somebody with some charisma. I read that Pete Buttigieg was the stand-in for JD Vance in the debate prep for Walz. That's interesting. That's kind of a fun one.
Well, see, I know how Tim Walz is actually going to win this debate. What they'll do is in the middle of it, they'll just wheel out some 1980s era pickup trucks, and each of them will have 30 minutes to get it running again. That's how they're going to settle this thing. It won't be policy. It'll be how fast can we tweak the carburetors.
Do you think there'll be a fly in the room?
Oh my gosh, I had forgotten about that. Oh my gosh.
That's the only thing I remember about that debate. Well, that and Kamala Harris saying, "Excuse me, I'm talking," or something like that.
Yeah.
The problem with this debate is different than the others is in a lot of ways these are two boring white men. I mean, they're literally by design intended to be relatively secondary figures. Yeah, J.D. Vance is very ambitious, but there's nothing sort of groundbreaking visually or really in any other way about the mashup. The last vice presidential debate had the first woman as a vice presidential candidate on the ticket anyway. So that was interesting, and certainly the first Black woman. The debates we've had this year have had some certain novelty to them. The Biden-Trump debate was a rematch we've never seen before in our lifetime. And then the way it went was historic. I doubt there will be that many people watching. I mean, it certainly won't be the kind of turnout that the ones with Trump have had.
You ready for a listener question?
I'm ready.
All right. So Thomas from Grosse Pointe asks, what would change if we had a popular vote for president? There's so much attention on Michigan with the ads. How would that change? What would change about how presidential candidates campaigned? Would it take even more money to run campaigns? Since you two seem to know a lot about the hows of campaigns, I figured I'd ask. Great show, and thank you. Well, thank you, Thomas. I think we should talk about this a little bit because the idea of a popular vote for president is a very popular one among many listeners that I know of. And what say you about this idea?
It's a very interesting question. It is true it would probably be more expensive because what would end up happening is that the campaigns would have to spend lots and lots of money in the most populous places in the country, California, New York, Illinois, Texas, Florida, and they would want to run up the score. You might see is the Democrats spending tons of money on those states and the Republicans spending tons of money on the states that they typically win. And then the rest of the states would be sort of not secondary, but they would probably follow a pattern. I don't think it means that the states we think of as swing states would become less important because it's still close in those states and they still would need it to be close in those states. You would still need to win or lose Michigan by a couple of points, win or lose North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, New Hampshire, Arizona by a couple of points because you'd still need those votes and you wouldn't want to lose any of those states by too much. The calculations would be very different. And yes, going into those major media markets would be more expensive. But the faith in the system is so shattered right now by people who, particularly if you're under 30, in your living memory, the two Republicans that won didn't win the popular vote. It's the first time they ran. And those two presidents, Bush and Trump, recast the entire Supreme Court almost. That is having a major effect on the rest of the country. And it doesn't feel fair. It doesn't feel just. It doesn't feel like it reflects what most Americans want their country to look like. The idea behind the Electoral College was essentially to try to prevent mob rule, to prevent the most populous parts of the country ruling over, everybody in an unfair way. And I get that. But we're kind of tipping over to the other side. And people really feel that. People really feel angry. I mean, if Trump wins this election and doesn't win the popular vote, which is his best case scenario, really, he's not going to win the popular vote. So if he somehow pulls it off and wins enough electoral votes to be the president again, even though he's never won the popular vote, people in this country are going to be just over it. They're just going to be so dismayed by how that's even possible. And it's very hard to explain to people from other countries. Have you ever tried?
No, and I've actually talked to a number of journalists from other countries in my work, and they are always completely befuddled. I mean, already our system's a little crazy to them because most democracies have a parliamentary system, but the lack of popular vote in the way that we describe it seems absolutely bat crazy to them. And honestly, it feels really bat crazy to a lot of listeners and a lot of people who are like, hey, you know what? It's not the 1700s or the 1800s anymore. And things have changed. I think some of the frustration also comes from because of the way that the Electoral College is and how the system works, you don't really have to change your policy to reflect what the public wants, right? Because like the public in general, in most of the country, is pro-choice, is pro-women's right to choose, right? And because of a system that is electoral, the Republican Party can stay in that world and keep that relevant when that is a position that is not a position that most of the country holds. And so it makes it very difficult for the public to push on the parties like, hey, this is something that I really want, or this is where we're at. It reinforces base control of the parties. Whereas a popular vote, it's like, well, you've got to do some things that are a bit more compromising or move your views with the times, which, I know that by definition, conservatives don't move their views with the times. Like being a conservative is about, being resistant to change at its heart in a way. But it's that idea of like having that thing. The other thing is that some people believe that a popular vote system might open up to more candidates. I don't know if that's the case because our system is so entrenched with money and also brand awareness that I don't know if a third party candidate's ever really a viable thing in this. I mean, there's some things you could talk about like with like ranked choice voting, which is starting to pop up in some areas of Metro Detroit, but that's creating a situation where sometimes you'll have, say, Democrats, going against each other in the final or something like that. It really is part of that root of the frustration that you're talking about, Steve.
Ranked choice voting has been very successful in moderating who gets elected in places like Alaska and even in California, at least for, federal elections for Congress and so on. The difference between our system and the parliamentary system is that the parliamentary system has many parties and a coalition has to be built in order to govern that requires compromise. And it requires some sharing of power. Essentially, that's what our primary system accomplishes here in the United States. Typically, you have, you always talked about it like back in 2020 with Democratic field, and it was, Elizabeth Warren had this lane, and Bernie Sanders had that lane, and Kamala Harris had this one, and Buttigieg, and so on. And the idea is that the primary system in the parties helps to moderate the eventual nominee when he comes out the other side. So all those different factions that would have been different parties in another country are all under one party, but they feed into it. It doesn't work very well anymore. This year it didn't work at all. This year there was no primaries. I mean, Nikki Haley was there essentially to give people a name to vote for who didn't want to vote for Trump, and otherwise there was no primaries. It was all name recognition. It was all people in power keeping power and staying where they are. That adds to the frustration. I'm not that concerned about the money because I think that the credibility of the system is in so much jeopardy right now that it's probably better. I know that there's a whole business where there's like it's like, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it, but there's this whole business where they're trying to get enough states to agree to.
I want to say it's like the Compact or something. I have the name, not National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
How is it supposed to work?
Well, it's supposed to be an agreement among a number of states and the District of Columbia to award all of their electoral votes to whichever presidential ticket wins the overall popular vote in the 50 states and DC. So the idea being is that, you change the rules so that, okay, we keep the Electoral College per se, but those Electoral College votes are then pledged by what the national vote tally is.
And I believe that they're not that far from 270.
Yeah, they have 77%, according to what I'm looking up here. So they have more than 2/3, actually more than 3/4 of the 270 votes that would be needed to give the compact legal force. So, the jurisdictions that are in are about 40% of the Electoral College. So this would have force if they could get just a few more states in.
I wonder what the Supreme Court would say about it.
It's an interesting idea, Steve. I would rather there just be a direct route as opposed to an end around route for it. But I mean, we work within the systems that we have. What do you think would be the number one thing? You mentioned about people losing some trust, and I agree with you. What do you think would be one or two things that would be key to regaining that trust in the system or building that trust up? Maybe not even regaining it, but building it up, actions that could be taken.
The big problem is that the people who agree on what facts are true would say one thing, and the people who don't would say another. So some of the remedies, like a popular vote or Supreme Court reform that adds justices, that makes perfect sense to people on the left, but also in the center to some extent. But the right would, like you said, lose their minds about it. So they would then be very upset and complain about changing the rules and all the rest of it. I think that it does go to a bigger problem we have with facts being facts and the public agreeing on what's real. Elon Musk today goes out and says that if Trump isn't elected, democracy is in grave danger. I don't get that. Like, wow,
I don't use X anymore. That's a good one. Oh my gosh.
It's just weird. It's another one of these, I know you are, but what am I kind of thing. No matter what you can say about Kamala Harris, I think it's been fairly well proven that the Biden-Harris administration has not been bad for democracy. I don't get it. I know they run around complaining about the weaponization of the Justice Department. It is unfortunate that their candidate is a felon. Not the Biden's people's fault for that. Meanwhile, they're running around indicting Democrats all over the place.
Eric Adams.
They indicted the mayor of New York. They indicted the senator from New Jersey. They indicted the congressman from South Texas. They indicted the president's own son. I mean, if this is a clever ruse to throw everybody off the scent of the fact that they're weaponizing government to attack and bring down Donald Trump, it's impressive. If that's what they're doing, I don't know. That's a pretty big, awesome scam they're pulling, you know.
I don't generally find the people to be that competent and that coordinated. No offense to anyone involved. It's just not usually the case.
No, I do think that'll be an interesting element of the conversation on Tuesday night with the vice presidential candidates, because it is J.D. Vance who has been on record saying that the government is not competent enough to fairly and appropriately execute a mass deportation plan. So if they're not capable of doing it, then why is that a top priority of this presidential campaign?
Well, Steve Freese, always good to talk to you. I appreciate you.
Hey, wait. But the Detroit Tigers are going to the playoffs.
That is the most exciting news that we've talked about. I am so happy about this. I was so happy that if you have not paid attention, if this is Monday and you didn't look back, we actually put together a special bonus episode of the podcast because it's such a big deal, Steve. Like,
it's very exciting.
I'm so excited about this as somebody who was alive for 1984, but I don't remember it.
My New York Mets seem just absolutely insistent on just ruining everything. I think they have to go to a double header with Atlanta because their games were canceled this past week because of the storms, and so I think it's still up in the air. But I mean, they went 3 games in a row where they just got bombed by whoever they were playing, and I guess they won today, which is nice. And I haven't read up on what it means, but I think it's still precarious.
Steve Freese, thank you so much for joining us. If you didn't know, he's a freelance journalist for the New York Times, Newsweek, and many others, and writes a weekly newsletter for the Ann Arbor Observer, and he joins us every Monday to talk politics. With that, I am Jer Stays. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to our members on Patreon, patreon.com/Daily Detroit. Your membership help keeps this going. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll talk tomorrow.